Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, microbiology has stepped into the world of cryptocurrency with a means of hashing the algorithm and done using E. coli. A fungal infection is turning into a silent pandemic. Vertical farming and the resources need to optimize it. Why legal documents are so hard to read, and it's not just the legalese. An examination of the SAT data, the development of an incredibly tiny memory crystal that could store incredible amounts of information, but is incredibly difficult to do so, the interesting way an Excel spreadsheet can actually destroy an entire system unexpectedly, how it is that time and space negatively affects your heart, and the synthesis of beta-graphene using dynamic covalent chemistry is retracted. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with Crypto Bro's next major selling point, the idea of being able to do all of the necessary work to get your various currency using E. coli or any number of other possible microorganisms. Understand, this is not something you can just do by taking a swab of whatever's growing in your fridge unexpectedly. It does require a considerable amount of engineering, and we mean that in terms of genetic engineering. What they had to do was take E. coli and modify the genome with a fairly significant amount of data. Admittedly, in terms of what you might think of for a computer with 1.1 megabytes of recombinant DNA, it may not seem all that much. But in terms of the data capacity of the genome, that's a significant amount. The other thing to note is that they were relying on a very old version, basically a predecessor to most modern cryptocurrency languages. So no, it's not perfect, but it is a very good sign that it can be done. With such synthetic biology leading the way, it's possible to find ways to more efficiently and economically do things like this that don't require ridiculous amounts of energy be channeled into the various systems you're using to analyze and resolve the various algorithms. This kind of sounds great, except when we get into the nitty-gritty details. Mostly that it was done with 66 wells that were meant to basically propagate a message saying what that well had found, except they don't know how to connect all of the wells that contained these various, let's say, cells that were doing the processing. The second issue is that in order to analyze and hash the entire string, this one, let's say, prototype needed 200 days. So there's some pretty big issues to do with the, let's say, capacity, particularly at this prototyping level. But in theory, if you were to look at it in terms of how many E. coli cells are in a single gram of, let's say, culture, and the ability to be able to use them all to optimum efficiency, you would gain incredible achievements. But that needs to be tempered against the issue around actually being able to control the computational ability of something biological. And therein lies the big problem. There is a big issue around being able to get life to work as a computer, as a lot of the time it just doesn't like doing that. Next we have the Cooker-Kirsch article, which is more a debunking of his bullshit, and honestly ridiculous bullshit. Fundamentally, he's trying to claim that an individual who received 3 vaccines for various conditions suddenly became severely ill within 10 minutes, and apparently not due to an allergic reaction, or at least he's certainly not making that claim, which is perhaps the only possible explanation. The short version of it is that a 23-year-old woman who had various issues, primarily paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, went to hospital to get further care. They gave her tetanus, pneumococcal, and meningitis vaccines. Now, what they're claiming is that because this all occurred within 10 minutes, and that they temporarily went blind in both eyes, had a locked jaw, began vomiting, and so on, that it was all caused by the vaccines. Now, temporal relationships do not necessarily mean actual relationships. Just because a light was green earlier doesn't mean you can cross now. It's probably turned red by this point. Conversely, just because it's red now doesn't mean it will necessarily turn green. This is the problem. Cooker-Kirsch has basically tried to make the argument of just because there's a temporal relationship, there is a factual relationship. But the signs and symptoms don't indicate that. In fact, PNH, or the condition that is already known to exist, that being paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, is known to produce exactly the same symptoms. As in, there is a much better understood, evidenced, and demonstrated explanation for this phenomena than vaccines did it. Which is somewhat hilarious, given that they're trying to argue that they're communicating the facts when, no, they're not. This is the problem with fundamentally the entire article as such, and we use that term very loosely. It's first of all containing a lot of issues around the information that's being presented, mostly relating to a failure to understand what's actually happening, the various possible mechanisms, and so on. And certainly, Kirsch has a history of being less than great in his communication of factual information, and instead how he interprets it. And so we basically wind up in this situation where you have nonsense all about somebody who fundamentally need to be vaccinated for their own damn protection, given what goes on in hospitals, particularly around issues with infectious diseases. Second, the symptoms they had were also similar and at least in line with being vaccinated for these things, and nothing that happened seems to have actually been derived from those vaccines. Compare this with a much better demonstrated causality, that being fungal infections and a effectively pandemic that's spreading. It's the issue around fungus, and particularly fungal infections, becoming increasingly resistant to what we can do to treat them. Certainly by no means are we at the level of antibiotic resistance amongst bacteria, but we are working in that general direction, and it's a big worry. To give some context, there's about 6.5 to 7 million people a year who are infected with fungal infections, or at least the nastiest of fungal infections. As a total, there are about 3.8 to 4 million people who die each year from said infections. That's a roughly 66% fatality rate. You can imagine how bad that is. Now, that's by no means anywhere near the rates of bacteria killing people, but it is a worry. In fact, we have a whole video dedicated solely to explaining partly why it is that fungi are such a pain to try and treat, mostly owing to how much more complicated they are, at least in relative terms, by comparison to bacteria, where you largely have just two major classifications, gram-positive and gram-negative, and that'll define more or less how you treat for them, in grossly oversimplified terms. In other very much causally linked and temporally linked events, we have slap fighting. It's basically if children had fights, except they're adults, and it's treated as more of a sport than a fight, which is kind of ridiculous and stupid. This also brings us to people looking into what happens when you engage in dumb and stupid activities. More so since natural selection hasn't been allowed to play out its role. Instead, they get treated, and what they get treated for is an increasing number of brain injuries. Nearly 80% of individuals involved in these slap fights have brain injuries from the activity. Again, not quite so bad as other sports, for example, American football, where there is a very high rate of brain injury associated with it, but nevertheless, this is a very niche sport, per se, and also, more importantly, it doesn't really have the kind of, attraction that something like American football does, let alone other sports. And as such, well, it's really dumb that you would have such a high rate of brain injury in something that's so silly. The gist of the activity is very simple. The two people stand in front of each other and take turns slapping the other's face with their open hand as hard as they can. And the one who, flinches or chooses to give up first is the loser. Of course, giving up, or even winning, won't protect you from the issues around concussion, and neurologists watching the 3 seasons that have occurred so far more or less note that, yeah, that's exactly what's happening. These individuals increasingly experience concussion throughout the season, and because of that, well, yeah, they're all getting brain damage, willingly getting brain damage. And as much as the American education system is a failure, it shouldn't be at a point now where that's actually something that people think is a good idea. And now there is admittedly one major flaw to this, and that is what they're using to qualify whether or not someone is concussed is entirely observational. There's no actual examination of the brain either through, say, autopsies or more likely to be something like brain imaging with MRIs. So that does give a very, very slim amount of, let's say, leeway to slap fighting to claim that they're wrong, but it would be very inconsistent with just about every other sport that shows the same kind of neurological signs and symptoms of concussion. Going to news that's all about credibility, and arguably more important than what we've spoken about so far in some respects, that is other than Kirsch's nonsense, which is more or less peddling anti-vaccine nonsense, we have the American Academy of Paediatrics and their increasing push to basically alienate and make into an evil boogeyman the products like GMOs, glyphosate, and various other things that are almost now essential to our safe, secure, and reliable food supply. And it all comes down to one individual. It's a pediatrician by the name of Philip Landrigan. And unfortunately, they're also the idiot responsible for most of this bullshit being allowed to be published. Yeah. Sadly, a lot of the time you can literally trace nonsense back to one person who decided it was their mission to make something happen. And then they start turning the body of literature, whether it's something like Seralini and glyphosate, it's this idiot, and GMOs or anything else, into a festering cesspit of bullshit, which other crackpots latch onto and claim, well, this was published. Yeah, and so was Seralini's research at first, until it was realized how bad it was. And we will get onto other retractions later on that fit into a similar bill. But despite this, the problem is very simple. It creates a situation in which you're creating a facade of truthfulness and reliability. But for those who actually know what they're looking at, that facade becomes a massive red flag that says this particular journal is not to be trusted in any way, shape, or form because they consistently and reliably publish things that are just not right, and they should know they're not right. And so you have things that are not remotely scientific in how they're analyzed, they provide disinformation or simply repeat propaganda that's been debunked, and in other instances engage in fear-mongering and shaming of things that shouldn't be either. And so we bring you to the Genetic Literacy Project, and it's very effective, very clear, and honestly somewhat worrying timeline of how it is that the American Academy of Paediatrics has failed to act on their publication of not just bad information, but in some respects, bad research that should be the question or purview of the provost of the university and the integrity of what's being done. Next we have vertical farming, and this is one thing that could be useful. Admittedly useful in a very limited context, mostly because all of the attempts so far to engage in vertical farming have failed. The problem is that they've not been able to scale up very effectively. Consider how vertical farming works. You basically have everything contained inside a building, and because everything is inside a building, everything has to be artificially generated or moved. Whether that is moving water and nutrients up into high places they can fall down, either as rain or simply as hydroponics, synthetically generated light, so grow lamps for instance, temperature conditions and everything else. Sure, you can have some humans involved, certainly to monitor things, and sometimes to harvest, but ideally, vertical farming should be as automated as possible, and that means they need lots of energy. Whereas your typical farming field is more or less completely dependent on nature once the seeds are planted and right through until they're harvested, with a slight oversimplification being used. Because of this, the amount of energy needed for vertical farming versus conventional farming creates a huge gap. And so the questions are, what do you need to do to make it possible for vertical farming to work? Well, the first and simplest is the nature of what you're growing. A lot of them need to start cultivating crops that are done in a far more innovative way, as a lot of the time the food they're growing isn't competitive to anything else in the same area, so they need to challenge what's locally available, rather than what they want to grow. This may sound obvious, but it's important. Next is the ability to use something that requires constant environmental conditions. That is something where you don't have to constantly change things, or at least where you can shift around your usage of energy to when it is the cheapest energy that's available. This needs dynamic control and may not be easy to achieve. The next issue is, well, exactly that, energy prices. At present, one of the major issues with vertical farming is simply cost. Once you start scaling up the facility, you need to recoup your costs, not just for the infrastructure, but for all the consumables that are going into it as it's working and before you can get any money out of it. And that's a problem, as a lot of the electricity costs are fairly straightforward, but they're very high. And that means you have a huge cost for a long time before you can get any money for it. Finally, the idea that it may be, and most likely will be, necessary to start breeding, if not genetically modifying crops, to make them more suitable to these vertical farms, as you're going to have to make changes to the way they behave and what they do to optimize them to function just like that. Consider the differences in, say, a creeping vine that produces cucumbers, zucchinis, squash, or anything else, versus something like a bush variety, which grows much more compact, but ensures that all of the growth is fairly limited in where it is. It maximizes yield and minimizes space requirements, at least by comparison. There are other variables that need to be considered as well, but this is just a start, and certainly the article provides much more detail than we'll go to in this video. Next we have effectively an immortal species. It's not the gym bro or internet troll, but rather it's a kind of jellyfish. It's the hydra jellyfish, but what's special about it is how it remains immortal. It has a sort of cancer that ensures that it will always keep growing, and even if parts of it are chopped off, well, they will keep growing in turn themselves and create cloned offspring. Sort of like, say, cuttings or air layers from a tree, shrub, or whatever. They will basically be a clone of the original, because you'll be able to cut them off and they'll start growing using their own roots once they've developed them. Where this is useful is partly in that we have creepy sea species, but also in understanding partly transmission of cancer and partly how to prolong life. Now, cancer is necessary for life, which, well, it sounds rather terrible, but understand, cancer is just the normal cell cycle driven into overdrive, where it behaves and repeats itself far more than it should and lacks an off switch. Because of that, you have a excessive growth of whatever cell that is there. And typically speaking, cells that have also mutated in other ways that make them not work as intended. But so long as that same cell cycle has that off switch in place, they will grow as needed and only when needed. And so it's effectively the same thing as cancer. As said, it just lacks that off switch. How the hydra jellyfish fits into this whole scenario is actually kind of straightforward. If you overfeed it in a laboratory setting, it will start to develop tumors of its own accord. In the wild, it can also do the same thing, but it's generally part of an asexual reproduction process. Like with some animal-based research, they basically overfed them, and 19 of the 25 that they were trying to grow developed extreme tumors. They then took these and continued the process through basically 5 generations of the tumor-forming buds. Basically 5 successive generations that seem to progressively reiterate and reinforce that tumor-developing behavior. As should be no real surprise, but certainly nice to have definitive evidence of, not only did there be a increase in the risk of cancer with successive generations having exactly the same cancer, but there was also a significant increase in mortality associated with that. So basically, if you have a history of cancer in your family and you're a jellyfish, you're kind of screwed. If you're a human, you're only likely screwed, at least in some respect. And next, in something that will screw you, we have legal documents. Those damned things you have to read every time you want to sign up for a new service, look at something, yada yada yada. Something nobody ever actually bothers to do, but they probably should. And the reason nobody bothers is partly because they're incredibly long and tedious, But the other issue is legalese, or all that legal language that's stuffed into them. Now, there have been several attempts to be blunt about it, tame this beast, mostly by making it so that something like, say, a EULA or end-user license agreement can only be one page and has to be in plain, simple language. These sorts of plans haven't gone anywhere very much, but nonetheless, it's kind of necessary. The other issue here is that, well, they're legalese. Nobody understands what the hell it is. What is really interesting about the research is that they tried to see if they could basically circumvent that issue by having people write their own law, put it in a story, and then try and explain it. And they found that despite the desire to write a clear law, nobody actually did, because there was a common feature called center embedding. That is, in the middle of a sentence, you suddenly include a definition, which is a terrible idea at the best of times, but nonetheless. By doing so, they make not only the sentences longer, but also more complicated, and as such, there is a way to arguably simplify much of the law that's out there, simply by removing that center embedding feature. Preferably by having something like a dictionary at the end of the law saying, these are the definitions for these things we've given, and in fact a lot of laws do this, and then do the same problem anyway, which defeats the purpose of having a set of definitions at the start of the document. In something that will never get simpler, we have mathematicians, and mathematics as a whole. And in this case, we have something called soft tilings. This is described as a new class of shape. The shape is fundamentally defined by two features. The first is it has two edges. One of these is always going to be a curve that's always going to have two corners, basically. So you essentially have a variation on a semicircle. Admittedly, it's a little more complicated, but that's basically what it is. These shapes will always be able to be tessellated and create a, let's say, a varied design. Admittedly, it's often a very repetitive design, but a varied design. Of course, there are different shapes because, well, it's basically two lines and 2 points, so there's a bunch of different things you could do with it. Why this is brought up is not so much that the shapes themselves are necessarily helpful at this point, but rather they play a fairly major role in the relationship of shapes and nature, particularly how it's possible, although certainly by no means an exclusive element, that there are principles that underlie the development of these shapes and the way that we see the same sort of phenomena in nature, for example, riverbanks and the islands within rivers. In terms of mathematics that's slightly more useful, we have the SAT. That's basically America's massive nationwide exam. Again, gross simplification, but understand it's when you take all the students in America and punish them by putting them in a room full of their peers, not allow them to communicate in any way, shape, or form, and then put pressure on them by telling them their entire future relies on what they put on a piece of paper. Slightly less glib, but still just as relevant, is how the data from the 2024 exams is coming out. Now, there are various criticisms of the SAT, and these are in some ways perfectly legitimate, and in other ways not so much. The first and most obvious criticism is going to be that, to an extent, the SATs are self-selecting. It's more of an opt-in system, but that's not true of every state. So rather than go through the issues around what's going on with everywhere in America, let's just look at one state, Michigan. Specifically because Michigan has one feature that's important. What it does is every student does the SAT. That means we can take away that selection bias problem. And it gets interesting once you start looking at what's going on here. In short, and understand there's some issues around Michigan just because of the, to be blunt about it, self-selection due to the population distribution of various races within it, you get very different outcomes. For example, as a general rule, Asians do much better, but multiracial and white individuals also do fairly damn well. You have worse outcomes for Hawaiians, Hispanics, blacks, and Amerindians, which is a weird way to describe them. But sure, let's stick with that. The other thing is that there's a fairly consistent bell curve amongst all of these groups. So it's not just that the groups are, as a whole, better or worse. There's a fair amount of overlap in that. and with a very gross approximation, the average is somewhere around 90, although understand 90 is not quite right and specifically related to IQ. But when we talk about the SAT score, things shift again, which is where it gets kind of important. The score ranges from roughly 400 up to 1600, and different groups have different outcomes. For example, there's a fairly large cohort, for example, females, who get about 900. That seems to be the majority, followed by the next major group between 1000 and 1190. Males are similar, although slight shifts in that. Amerindians have just about everybody in the 800 to 900 bracket. You have in the other groups, primarily Hispanic and Hawaiians, the majority of them are in the same area. But if you look at who makes up the majority in each group, this shifts based on the SAT scores both last year and this year. There are notable differences, and it does create interest, purely observational interest, as to differences in who gets what result, and as a result, how the rest of their life will play out, at least to some extent. In terms of the rest of their life, we have life as a PhD student, and a new paper from Swedish research that examines what's going on. Now, to be clear about it, the study does have some pretty major concerns, but it's also fairly consistent with what we're aware of with regards to, to be blunt about it, the findings. The short version is that if you want to go on to do a postgraduate degree, be prepared to suffer. And we're not just talking about the usual suffering of terrible supervisors. Rather, there is a notable health impact, a mental health impact, on PhD students. This is interesting, not just because of what it is, but the fact it's a working paper, which basically means that this is something that they're building up on. What they found is by following the PhD students from both before and after their PhD, you see that there is pretty much a consistent and reliable increase in the, psychiatric medication that they're taking relative to everyone else. Basically, they have a significantly higher utilization rate, somewhere between 1 and 2% higher than their comparatively highly educated individuals, and very similar to the general population, which is basically saying that they're dragging up everybody's use of uppers and downers. The other issue here is that the number of individuals, that is the relative percentage of students who are doing their postgraduate degree and are taking medication, goes up almost immediately after beginning. And it's only around the 5th year, or basically after they've extended all of the time they possibly can, that they have access, should say, stop having access to medication, or at least since this is Sweden, they still have access, but they just don't care anymore, and you see a drastic drop-off. Admittedly, nowhere near the same level as they were before their studies, but still, it's a notable change. What gets kind of scary, at least for students who are doing their PhD, is the number that get hospitalized during their studies. Understand, the idea that doing your degree, or at least studying and doing research, should get you hospitalized, that is, sent to a psych facility, is a terrifying thought. Mostly because individuals who are doing so are pretty damn passionate about what they're up to, and if it breaks their mind that badly, yeah, that's not good. There is a slight concern of this figure, at least with regards to the error bars, but otherwise, it's still pretty terrifying. Of course, again, remembering that this is all relative comparisons to the general population, relying on medical records and so on, so there are some issues here. But just be aware, it would appear, at least based on Swedish research, that doing a postgraduate study, and particularly a PhD, will break you mentally and possibly physically. Next, we move on to the idea of storing data, which, if you're a researcher, is particularly important, and apparently involves research at the University of Southampton. What they do is take a small crystal, and they're able to use a laser to inscribe a lot of data into it, And by a lot of data, we're talking about 360 terabytes of data. That may be enough to store your special interest collection, the folder that you have marked on usually on your hard drive. The questions we have about this, other than the fact that, well, sure, you can store a lot, but can you access it, is the big issue here. The access issue is probably going to be a major concern, as the idea is to be able to store information on this thing for an incredibly long time, and under incredible conditions, whether that's freezing or fire, that you can, well, as mentioned, store a lot of data on it. And it's a reasonably readily available product. It's basically the equivalent of fused quartz, and as such, you should be able to make this with a reasonable amount of reasonably accessible, let's say, production. It's not like we're talking about ultra-specialized production in terms of needing to have incredibly large, let's say, radiators and pressure pots for making diamonds. In a similar sort of news, we have a new transistor device that could very much help to develop our ability to process things. Understand, transistors are getting smaller and smaller every day. Admittedly, how many of these smaller and smaller transistors can find their way into a commercial application, different matter. But we can only get so small before we start to encounter problems. And that's pretty much the biggest barrier that's going to come up on us very soon. But while we get smaller, computers get faster. And so if we can keep making them smaller, computers will keep getting faster. And this is where what's being called an ultra-thin ferroelectric material might be able to help us. It relies on boron nitride, and by having 2 layers of material, a small electrical charge can be applied, and it causes the configuration of both the boron and nitrogen atoms to shift slightly. This allows for the transistors to become not only incredibly thin, but incredibly fast. And arguably, if this can be scaled up and used at a commercial level, it means much smaller devices that need less power. The other thing to be aware of is that because we're talking about effectively only the slightest shift in the properties of these things, they're able to work for an incredibly long time without wear and tear, or at least such little wear and tear, that it's estimated that they can be turned on and off 100 billion times with no adverse effects. Effectively better than the current flash-type devices we use for data storage. Something you'll be aware of if you've ever had a flash drive fail on you and you have to swear angrily about having, say, lost an assignment. Next we have a, let's say, Reddit post, to best describe it, all about what happens when just one small issue in your email, and particularly in this case, an email with an Excel attachment, can cause a failure of something very important. In this case, it has to do with the way the physical features of copper wire were altered and triggered in such a way that they caused a gross failure of all sorts of other things. The issue here is that there are headers at the top of your Excel file, and understand this is XLS, not XLSX, the newest version of the Microsoft Excel format. By having that go through the system, it turned it into a pattern, and that pattern is necessary for the transmission of the information. And that signaling pattern became a problem with the copper wire, causing it to basically fail. It wasn't just a, oh, oops, something went wrong. It was a, literally, you have to replace the hardware kind of failure. But we're not going to go into the details, as we're certainly not wanting to take away from the author's own work. But if you want to read it, it's certainly interesting to see how there's an interface between digital and physical elements that sometimes you just don't expect. In terms of purely digital elements, we have Australia, and the fact that they're currently in the process of completely shutting down their 3G network, that is their mobile phone infrastructure or cell tower infrastructure. And there's a problem with this. There's a lot of farming equipment in Australia that apparently relies on the 3G network, and when you remove this, shit's going to hit the fan really hard and really fast. Mostly down to the simple fact that, well, farmers aren't in a position to replace expensive and large agricultural equipment. And at least in Australia, it seems, the network only covers 98.5% of the population. That 1.5% of the population also largely represents farmers. And, farmers are kind of important. They make the food that keeps you alive. This is on top of the rather more immediate and significant concern of, if you're on a farm and have an accident, it's likely to be a nasty accident, and if that occurs, you need to be able to call for help, and if you don't have mobile phone coverage, you won't be able to get help. So yeah, this is going to be an interesting thing to play out in the near future. In other health-related news, less accident-oriented, but rather focusing solely on what happens when you're in space, and nobody can hear you scream. It seems your heart gets weaker, which isn't all that surprising when you consider how the heart works and various other factors. We've known for a very long time now that being in space is not good for your health, whether it is the rather obvious fact that your muscles get weaker, they don't need to work when you're in space, or at least nowhere near as much. There are issues around bone density loss, vision changes, gene expression, and, well, the obvious problems of psychology when you are stuck in a small container with various other people that you may or may not be on best terms with, and absolutely no way away from them. In this case, however, the heart is rather weird and interesting. Part of the experiment is based on samples of human heart tissue that have been on the space station about 30 days, but they also seem to have data based on the actual astronauts themselves. What they found from doing this is, well, as said, rather worrying. The heart gets weaker to some extent, and so when you have all the other problems of being an astronaut in space for a long time, your heart may not get picked up as the first and most significant worry. But that's not something that should happen. Your heart is kind of important if you weren't aware. When it gets too small or too weak, it's bad. When it gets too big, it's bad. It's why the Grinch should have died, not found he's happy ever after. In terms of the cell culture results, well, what we're observing should be fairly predictable, but it's based on the observation rather than the actual problems. First of all, the sarcomeres were shorter and weren't set up the right way to a certain extent. The mitochondria had various issues around the way it was structured as well, and there were genes that all indicated that there were issues around inflammation and an increase in free radicals. For the most part, that's basically oxygen species that can cause harm. Next we go to a Ig Nobel Prize winner, and it's an individual who spent a weird amount of time looking into blue zones. It's basically areas with exceptional lifespans. And, well, yeah, it's basically looking into why do people live longer and where do they live longer. The research itself pretty much looks into the idea that people live longer, but are we actually living longer because those people are doing something different? Or is there something else going on here, particularly around data collection for the most part? And they found, yeah, actually, there's an issue to do with what we're getting, not necessarily what the actual results are. And so if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. In short, what they found is that most people who live longer tend to lack birth certificates, live in areas that are high level of poverty. It tends to be fewer 90-year-olds, and there is an uncomfortable amount of pension fraud going on, which would also explain some of the issues around people being over 100. The very short version is that blue zones tend to be an area where people are thought to be alive in theory, but dead in practice. The last news item we have for you is a fairly high-profile article that has been retracted, and it's all about the creation of a new form of carbon, which obviously should be raising a lot of red flags immediately. But what's important here is that we're talking about graphene and the role it has, and therefore how they're thinking this new carbon could be making a better diamond or graphite product, or graphene in other cases. And as such, well, that sounds great until you put it in practice. What is interesting about this is not so much that it's been retracted, but the fact that the authors responsible were willing to retract it with relatively little issue. Understand, the problem is not that it's been retracted and that the reasons it was retracted are substantiated, mostly because they don't seem to actually affect the end claimed result, as it was only a supplementary figure, that is something that's not needed but nice to have, that was altered by what they'd done. What is key here is that they did so fairly quickly. This might be down to other issues that were identified by separate researchers and not the university itself. In short, some of what they were up to looks like it may have been, well, to be blunt about it, simulated data and not explainable by any reasonable means. and rather than being publicly eviscerated and embarrassed for being so very dodgy, they instead chose to simply wave the white flag. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.